Thank you, Tina, for that introduction, and thank you, Dr. West, for joining me today. And Nadja, it's so good to be here with you today. Before we get started, I wanted to share that we will be taking questions. If you want to ask something, please select the Ask a Question on the toolbar located on the left side of the Chime Live site. Then type in your question and hit submit, and we'll take questions about 10 minutes before the session is scheduled to finish. So, Nadja, it's been an incredible time in our history. I feel like we're just constantly navigating massive uncertainty. And even though it feels like we're in a better place in the United States, our perspective is global, and it feels like the world won't be safe until the world is vaccinated. So could you share your perspective on what it's been like to sit on the boards of two healthcare companies during this incredible crisis?
Yes, and thanks, Paul. And it's really great being with you here today. And appreciate the question. And you're absolutely right. This has been an unprecedented time of uncertainty, chaos, everything that you'd like to think of. And here in the East Coast, now we're dealing with the cicadas. There's always something. So yeah, this has really been a time of all kinds of things that are thrown at us. But being on the boards, first of two companies, two phenomenal companies, I just want to say it's been really awesome to see. And I don't know if everyone out there sees behind the scenes what great work that the members of each one of the companies have done, both at Tenet and Johnson & Johnson. I mean, the individuals coming to work every day to take care of patients or to provide life-saving countermeasures, vaccines to save, on a huge scale. And so everyone coming to work and doing that was really great to see. And I just want to thank everyone for that, and the board members as well. On behalf of my fellow board members, we saw that their courage and devotion was unbelievable. But what we've seen, and I saw from the beginning from both, is that management and the senior leadership really did not wait for us to pull information from them. They were in the push mode of pushing information out, keeping us informed what's going on, to maintain agility in their companies. They didn't just have kind of like the old, the image of, little kids playing soccer, everybody runs to the ball. I mean, everybody wasn't running to this crisis. There were a group of people identified to handle that, and the rest of the organization worked really hard. Both organizations worked hard to continue to provide the services that they provided. So it was great seeing that, the agility, the adaptability to flex. Early on when PPE was short or supplies of things were short, there were no countermeasures and no, as you know, how long it takes to get a vaccine, in the pipeline is decades sometimes. And for what the teams had to do to buckle down and say, how are we going to do this, was just remarkable to see. So as board members, being able to see that, seeing the ability to identify what needed to be done, but not to turn so fully that they lost sight of what their primary mission was, their strategic direction that they were taking their organizations in. And so that was really awesome to see.
Yeah. Nadja, when I was interviewing for my role, I've been the CEO of KPMG now for about 11 and a half months. When I was interviewing for my role back in December of 2019, the first question the board asked me was, what do you think will be the major disruptors you'll have to face if you are elected the CEO and chair of KPMG? And I can tell you that a global pandemic wasn't on my list of possible major disruptors, nor was a social justice crisis. But I know that you've been reading a new book that provides a scientific account of the impact of this pandemic on society and how we live. Can you just talk a little about what you think the greatest challenges are for us as we move forward as organizations, and what role does the board play? What guidance can the board provide to management during such an uncertain time where we've lived through such an incredible period of change?
Yeah, and thanks for that, Paul. And the book I was reading was a recommendation from a fellow board member on another company, and it's called Apollo's Arrow by Nicholas Christakis, and he's a physician and a sociologist. And one of the things, of course, he talked about the scientific parts of like the plagues of early, third century plague all the way through, and then the human response to it. And I think the point that he made is that we can we can throw science at people all day long, but we cannot forget the human dimension because the psychological effects. I mean, and that's why when we define, in his commentary was, in part of it, was that when we define epidemics, we have to not just look at the social, the economic aspects of the threat, which are of course and a physical threat, but then the psychological dimensions. Because to cope with the plague of the past and the 21st century plagues, we are responding with interventions, but we also have to remember the human feelings in response to this. I mean, and all those things that it bears, and especially if you want to come out on the other side. And that's when I think what you're talking about is recovery. So how do we move forward? What's the next step in this? And I think one of those things is it's just that there's always this back to normal sentiment. People want to get back to normal, and I think there's no back. It's springing to a new or evolving to a new chapter. And some of the things, of course, we want to revert back to what we used to do in certain areas, but we also want to learn from what's happened, and to try to find those silver linings. I mean, it's hard to find a silver lining in tragedy when you've had millions of people around the globe die, and over 500,000 right here in our United States. But you have to find out, how can we learn from this? And I think seeing how the boards are saying, what are some of the things that we need to do? How do we adjust to the new realities that were imposed? The supply chain issues, the work issues, the workforce, the remote working versus coming back into our familiar work settings. How do we remain nimble so other facets of businesses are not impacted, or what are the things that we take, like telehealth, for example? Is that a new way of, I mean, it's not new, but is that a way that we're going to see at the forefront of addressing the issues of disparity in healthcare? Because there are some areas where there's, healthcare deserts, and maybe this is a way of saying, okay, how can we reach into these communities? And maybe telehealth is one way for certain aspects, of course, of primary care and things. So I think that how the board helps with that is just bringing experience to the table from other areas to provide a sounding board for the leadership. And again, as we talk about board members, our job is eyes in, fingers out. We don't go in and run things. We help the very capable leadership teams and management teams that each company or all the companies have, and what can we do to assist them in being sounding board, and then also making sure we're keeping an eye on the strategy and doing our role as board members, our responsibilities of oversight, for the shareholders and other stakeholders in the business.
Yeah, and Nadja, the return to work, getting back to something that's a bit more normal, is certainly on the top of every management team and every board's agenda. And I'm really appreciative that you talked about the human dimension in your last comments. Human capital has never been more important, and focusing on our employees as humans has never been more critical. I know recently one of our employees in a workshop said, in the future, I want our leaders to see us as humans and not resources. And never has there been a brighter light shined on people for their own humanity than has been the case during this pandemic and during this social justice crisis. And certainly you refer to telehealth, but it's not just physical well-being, right? It's also mental or psychological well-being, which has really been tested during this crisis. So as we start to think about getting back to something more normal and people start to navigate what they used to experience, how should we be thinking about that return to office, and particularly with the vaccines now being prominently available in society, in the US at least?
Yeah. Paul, I'm really glad you mentioned that, what you're hearing from from individuals, that they want to be seen as human beings, as people, and not just items to be, used to get to an end. And I, in the military, I do some talks on leadership. And one of the things I mentioned, I mean, there's a perception maybe in the military setting that, soldiers, do as they're told and they go here. But we had a very, prominent senior leader. This is, he joined in the 1930s, but he was a war fighter through multiple wars. And one of the comments attributed to him is that soldiering is an affair of the heart. Now, you wouldn't think of that from like a warrior, but he said you have to care, you have to love your soldiers. And he meant that you have to see them as the human beings that they are, what the value that they bring, the fact that they have lives, they have hopes, they have dreams, they have families, they've got, fears, all these things. They're human beings. They're not just, they're not just cannon fodder, so to speak. People just to take that hill, do this. You have to love your soldiers because look what you asked them to do. And so I think it's the same thing in the situation with our with the workforce of any company. You have to, quote, love your employees or your teammates as individuals and see, and then you can better, once they know that you are making the effort, that's the whole thing about empathy, making an effort to see them as multidimensional people, and that you really are taking that into account when you're making decisions. And again, with the return to work, I think that really, shows people feel valued. They feel like they belong, and that's really a boost to morale, and I think a boost to the organizations. And so both of the companies that I'm in are seeing that back to work. They are taking that into account. They're phasing it in. It's not like, hey, everybody get back to work. It's like, how can we learn again those silver linings? And so there's a phased-in approach that all the companies that I have the fortune of sitting on the boards of are looking at. How do we bring our teammates and our employees back in a compassionate and empathetic manner, but realizing we're a business and we still have to get back to work. And some of them never left, right? Some of the healthcare frontline workers have been at work every day. And so I think there's really a great emphasis putting on how do we do this thoughtfully and carefully to take care of our people, but also make sure that we are taking care of those who are depending upon us for the services provided in each of the companies.
Yeah, we certainly heard from our employees that they want us to be more flexible and less rigid as we think about how we talk about coming back to the office. And, one of the things that we're really proud of is during the pandemic at KPMG, we had less turnover of women than men, which is sort of the opposite of what many organizations experienced. And we think it's a testament to some of the programs we put in place during the pandemic around educational support, caregiver support, expanded leave for those that are dealing with the impacts of COVID-19. But that word flexibility, Nadja, is going to be the word that we have to use in the future to design that future state of work. And we're all thinking about the workforces of the future and the way we come at these hybrid models that we keep talking about. So as you think about that flexibility, is there anything that you see in the future design of work that is being talked about at the companies that you deal with that might be interesting to our audience as we move forward into a new phase of dealing with this crisis?
Yeah, I think the very things that you mentioned, there's a desire to ensure that they're taking all those things into consideration. So the flexibility, the agility, adaptability, all those words are important because that actually strengthens the organizations when you have people that can flex for the next kind of crisis that's coming up. And so that is being definitely discussed in the companies. They're keeping the board members apprised of here's kind of what our plans are. And they're also hearing from their teammates and employees, here's what we're hoping to have, happen in the future, to make sure that our workforce is strong and they feel relevant and they feel a sense of belonging and that they're cared for, because it's going to be very important. How they deal with change management, again, not only that reflects not only the how you treat the workforce and how the workforce, but also that actually strengthens the organization, as I mentioned, for any future, the kind of the what's next, what's around the corner. In the Army, we have a phrase of saying, there's always these battle plans, these great plans. They said, the greatest plans, fall away at first contact with the enemy, right? Because guess what? The enemy gets a vote. You have a great plan of what you're going to do, but the enemy is also planning. And so we're not necessarily in a war, but, what's the enemy? Is it a environmental, like a natural disaster? Is it a, public health issue? So I think that's kind of one of those things where we benefit, the organizations benefit by, encouraging that adaptability and agility. And then it helps with change management in every area.
Yeah, and I know that I speak to a lot of CEOs and business leaders and board members, Nadja, where they all say the same thing. It's remarkable. They say that we are still in the phase of designing what that future hybrid or flexible work looks like. And that's quite amazing, to think that at this point, that's where we still are. But I think it's the right place to be, because everybody, I think, in the future is going to be looking for more flexibility. I know I've traveled a couple of times in the last 3 weeks, and I took note of how much time I lost commuting. Whereas the last 14 months, I didn't have to worry about that and went from one meeting to the next without that interruption. I think our employees are going to be thinking that way a bit too, about their experience the last 14 months versus what they're getting back into. And I think we have to be very aware and cognizant that they're going to experience something different and maybe awkward and re-entering the workspace. I think that's going to be really important as we move forward. But if you don't mind, can I change topics for a moment? Because it's really related to this whole topic of culture transformation. And that is the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. At KPMG, we've made that a cornerstone of our strategy. And what I mean by that, Nadja, is that before the killing of George Floyd, we often thought about diversity, equity, inclusion as something that was sort of run through our HR organization. And in no way am I trying to diminish the importance of HR. It's critically important. But we took a strategic approach to saying, no, this needs to now be the strategic thrust of our business leaders. We have to be accountable. I have to be accountable. The person that runs that runs each of our three businesses must truly be accountable for driving meaningful progress when it comes to driving a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace at KPMG. So as you look at organizations, Nadja, that are doing well today, that are improving on diversity, equity, and inclusion, what are you seeing, and what are you seeing that we're not getting right quite yet that we need to still work on? And this may be also what you see as the role of the board in this area.
Hey, Paul, great question. And I've seen, across the board, I think it was one of those tipping points, one of those things that really enabled, no joke, real conversation, not the superficial wave top, let's talk about this, and not retreating into our corners of defensiveness and like, well, it's really like, hey, we need to do something about this. This is something that it's not outside the gate, so to speak, like in the military terms, or it's not outside of our doors. And I've seen several of the board, well, all the boards that I'm on, of course, take this extremely serious, take it seriously. And a lot of them have been doing things that really haven't been publicized necessarily. Of here's, we find it's important. There's credos that they have of how they treat other people, how they treat their teammates, the culture of their organization. But all of those even looked and said, hey, we thought we were doing pretty well, but we can always do better. We really didn't see the deep-seatedness of it and how it permeates through the organization. Because usually at the senior levels, they understand this is an issue and this is a concern and this is something that we need to take seriously. But the question becomes, how do you get your first line supervisors who really want to make a difference and change? A lot of them don't, quite know how to start the conversation, right? They don't know how to start the conversations without, fearing of offending someone or being, so people are really kind of on needles and pins on how to really start. And so I think the companies that have really leaned forward to say, this is something that needs to be done, and it's not just within our walls. It's because all of our people and our teammates live in communities around where we have, parts of our organization. And so I'll use Nucor as not a healthcare facility as an example, where the CEO, right from the first point, said, hey, we need to do something. Reached out to all of his teammates, started, actually brought me in as a board member because I offered, again, hey, I'll be a resource if you need to. They actually flew me down to say, hey, talk to our team. How do we get started? And they really had those crucial conversations. And really, it was part of their DNA. And they said, hey, we're doing more than just trying to do right for our teammates, but what can we do outside in the communities in which they live? Because guess what? They have to, kind of run a gauntlet, some of them, when they come to work. So they may have a nice environment and work, but I think there's a lack of understanding of what they go through in their communities. And I think, so that part of it, Paul, is, just having that understanding, identifying the things that they have been doing and then and it's not just lip service, it's got to be those hard conversations and actions. It's, bold actions. And I've seen all three companies, the companies that I'm on take those bold actions of that are visible results that you can look at and say, yes, they hear it. And they also want to make sure it's sustainable, not let's do this for 6 months and then check the block and then move on when this kind of quote blows over. So that's what I think. And as board members, our oversight to make sure that they keep, keep on that as they're dealing with everything else, post-pandemic, all these things that are coming up.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. And certainly understanding the lived and shared experience of our Black colleagues and all underrepresented colleagues is critically important. And I think that's what those conversations really did promote in our organizations, which is so critically important. And you're right, unless we really change this time, we're not going to make the kind of progress we need to make. So Nadja, I think we have about 9 minutes left. I know the audience has some questions, so I'm going to turn to Judy and see what questions the audience has for us.
Sure, we have a couple. So how prepared companies and boards, how prepared are companies and boards to face the future and perhaps new types of pandemic? Despite previous pandemics like SARS in 2002, 2004, COVID caught many by surprise.
Nadja, do you want to go first or?
No, I did all the talking there, Paul. Let me give you a chance to say that from the CEO's perspective. I think that's so important.
No, yeah, so that's a great question because this will not be the last pandemic. Let's just say that. And we certainly at KPMG, we formed a pandemic response committee, and we consulted with the Mayo Clinic throughout this crisis, and we continue to do so. And we will continue to do so into the future because we have now seen that this is the kind of disruptor that has to be in focus constantly. If there's nothing great, there's nothing good about a pandemic whatsoever, but I think it has prepared us to think about a future where there will be more disruption because of health events. And never has there been more acute shortages of talent either. I don't know about you, Nadja, but the thing that probably gets the most conversation with a lot of the leaders I talk to right now is just that shortage of talent. And we have to be focused on what their needs are and what we can do as leaders to help them respond to these kind of health crises, whether it's the impact on their psychological health or whether it's the impact on their physical health.
Nadja, you mentioned supply chains a while back, and given the fact that Merck and J&J are working together to produce vaccines, can you walk us through a little bit about how that is working?
Right, and I think I can't speak for Merck, but for Johnson & Johnson, I know the team with their credo of, it's about, their pillars are taking care of people and communities, and it's not about granted, there are competitors in most instances, but this is a crisis, right? People are dying, and that kind of tells the culture and the character of a company when it's like, hey, all hands on deck. We need to fix this. It's not about who's in charge or who gets the credit or who's this. It's like, what can we do? And so that's working quite well. And as you know, J&J offered the vaccine at nonprofit. Purchasing, because it's about getting people, saving lives, not about profit or even though it's a company, it's a business, right? But the first thing is people and taking care of community. So that's been working very well. And, how can we work together to get the best solution to literally save lives?
So I guess both of you could probably answer this, but I'm going to direct this one to Paul first. KPMG is a large company, and reopening offices around the world, let alone just in the United States, is going to be a large feat. What are your current plans, and are you mandating that employees wear masks and also be vaccinated in order to return to work?
So at KPMG, what we've done is we have told our employees that nobody's required to be back at the office before September. And that means if you're uncomfortable going to the office, then we will respect that. At the same time, we are on a pilot basis reopening offices at stage levels. So initially 10%, then 25%. And we're testing safety protocols to ensure that we can safely reopen offices as we all start to get used to seeing each other again in the office and being back together at client sites or the office. The other important thing that we recently announced to our employees, which is only about 10 days ago, is that if you are vaccinated, that in the office, you're not required to wear a mask or socially distance or at client sites unless the client insists upon that as the protocol. And we have not said that anyone has to have the vaccine. So we have not mandated the vaccine, but what we have done is we've strongly encouraged our employees to get the vaccine, and we will continue to do so. I think also by saying if you are vaccinated, you no longer have to wear a mask or socially distance. What we've also said is if you're not vaccinated, you do have to wear a mask and you do have to socially distance when you return to the office or a public site. So that's the approach we've taken, and we're going to constantly calibrate and recalibrate and think about what we're doing. But at the end of the day, the health and safety of our people is first and foremost, it's paramount. And that's been our view during the whole crisis, and that's the way we'll continue to operate into the future.
Nadja, do you have an opinion on that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul, in his final statement is where everyone is. It's what's the right thing to do to keep not only the healthcare or the workers, and there's a variety of occupational specialties in the healthcare industry, but also the patients and those that they come in contact with. And so that's the number one thing. But then it's also back to the point that Paul made earlier, is the flexibility. They're introducing flexibility where it's appropriate. But the safety is, safety and health of their people and those that they serve is at the forefront of any decisions that they're making.
I think we have time for one more question. How did scenario planning position the companies with which you work? And, did you see that the scenario planning helped to successfully pivot during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I'll just go real quickly first. It certainly did. So, we are an audit, tax, and advisory firm, a very complex business, a lot of service lines. And we do everything that we've always done in a remote fashion. It's amazing. And we've done and performed extremely well during the crisis. And a lot of that is a testament to the hard work, the scenario planning, the pandemic response committee that I spoke about earlier, working with our business leaders to ensure that we got the tools and the technology into the hands of our people to serve our clients and our communities, very importantly, during this crisis. And never has there been a more important time to think about the stakeholders that we're serving, from clients to our people to our communities. And I certainly think that planning has been really beneficial to us as we move forward through this crisis.
Thanks. And I would agree. What I've seen, for example, with Tenet, I mean, the scenario planning, they had almost a military-like, operations center and cell of individuals who are actually looking at things like that. And for the PPE, initially, they really were, forward-looking on how to make sure that they had enough PPE to continue their mission and to keep their people safe, early on, and then we're flexing throughout. Same with Johnson & Johnson. It's a global company. The scenario planning that they do, and just seeing as a board member, just seeing the diligence that they have of, with all the moving pieces, globally, of how they have to do scenario analysis to make sure that they're successful in each one of the markets that they're in, and the same for the others. And again, Nucor is not a healthcare company, but just their approach to it, not being a healthcare company, realizing a public health issue, how do they best manage it? And their scenario planning didn't deal with that, but how could they be useful and helpful in this crisis? And they actually repurposed some of their resources to make face shields and things like that. So non-traditional items to help in this. So they were able to plan and flex in all the communities that they were in as well. So all of them did a phenomenal job of that.
Thank you very much. Paul, I believe that we are now out of time. So thank you both so much for your participation. This has been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Nadja. It was an honor sharing this virtual stage with you. Good to
Same
see
here, Paul. It's really, really nice meeting you and nice, nice having a chat with you.
you. Thanks. Take care. Bye, everybody.